My brother didn't call to tell me he'd been added to my bank accounts. He called to tell me he loved me. That's the part that still makes me feel sick when I think about it. I was in the ICU on a Tuesday. By Friday, he had moved $42,000. He sent me a voice message that same Friday, his voice soft, a little shaky, saying he was praying for me, that the whole family was praying for me, that I needed to focus on healing and not worry about anything else. He said, "We're handling everything, okay? Just get better. We love you." I listened to that message 3 times lying in a hospital bed with a tube still taped to my arm. And I cried. Not because I was suspicious, because I felt so lucky to have him. I should start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. It always does with family. Growing up, my brother was the one who got the praise. Not because he was smarter or worked harder. He just learned earlier than I did that our parents needed to feel like they'd done something right. He gave them that. Good grades he'd announce at dinner. Friends he'd bring home on weekends so our mother could make a fuss over them. He knew exactly how to fill a room with warmth that was mostly directed at himself. I was quieter. I kept things closer. Our father used to say I was hard to read, which I think was his way of saying I didn't perform gratitude the way he wanted me to. We weren't close, my brother and I, but we weren't enemies. We were just 2 people who happened to share a childhood and a last name and very little else. He lived 40 minutes away. We texted on birthdays. We showed up to the same Thanksgivings and sat on opposite ends of the table, and that was fine. That was enough. What changed everything started with a Tuesday morning in November and a patch of black ice on Route 9. I don't remember the impact. I remember the sound. A sound that I can only describe as the world deciding it was done being quiet. And then nothing. And then a ceiling. And then voices. The doctors told me later that I had a fractured sternum, a collapsed lung, and a bleed on the left side of my brain that required emergency surgery. They told me I was unconscious for 11 days. They told me a lot of things in that careful, measured way that doctors speak when they're delivering information they've had to deliver before. What no one told me, not the doctors, not the nurses, not my mother who came every day and held my hand and looked at me with her eyes too wide and her mouth too careful, was what my brother was doing while I was unconscious. He was listed as my emergency contact. He'd been added to my emergency contact form years ago when I'd first moved to the city and didn't know anyone. I'd never updated it. Why would I? Nothing had ever happened. The hospital called him the night of the accident. He drove up, he spoke to the doctors, he nodded at the right times. My mother was too overwhelmed to ask questions. She's always been like that. Grief pulls her inward, makes her quiet and soft and easy to manage. My brother stood beside her in the hallway and said things like, "Let's wait and see." And she's a fighter. And everyone was grateful to have someone who could hold it together. He held it together so well that he was back at work by Thursday. What I know now, pieced together over months, with the help of my friend Quincy, who is a paralegal and who spent more than a few evenings at my kitchen table going through bank statements with me, is this. My brother had co-signed on a small personal loan with me 4 years prior. It was nothing significant, a few $1,000s to help him through a rough patch between jobs, and I'd never asked him to pay it back because that's what you do for family, or at least that's what I believed at the time. When he co-signed, his name briefly appeared on one of my accounts. He never removed it. Or rather, I never thought to check. From that single oversight, he built something I still can't fully believe. He went to my bank branch in person. He brought identification. He said he was managing his sister's affairs while she was incapacitated. He was calm and organized and had the right documents. Documents I later learned he'd ordered copies of from the county clerk weeks before, when my grandmother passed away and I'd mentioned to him, casually, that she'd left me some money. I'd told him that in passing. A phone call in September. I'd said something like, "Grandma May left me a little something in the will. I still can't believe it." I wasn't bragging. I was touched. Grandma May had grown up with nothing, and she'd died with a small life insurance policy and a savings account, and she'd split it between me and my cousin, and it meant more to me emotionally than financially. But it meant something financial to my brother. He did the math quietly and on his own. The bank should have caught it. I know that now. There were errors made. There are conversations I've had with attorneys about those errors. But the simplest truth is that my brother is charming and confident, and he told a story that was close enough to the truth to pass, and by the time I woke up, the money was gone. Not all of it. He wasn't greedy enough to take everything. That might have been what saved him, actually, or what he thought would save him. He left a balance. Just enough that if I looked at a statement, I might see a number and not immediately panic. The first time I noticed something was 3 weeks after I came home from the hospital. I was still sleeping 12 hours a day. My ribs hurt when I breathed too deeply. I had a follow-up appointment every Tuesday and a prescription list taped to my refrigerator. I wasn't exactly in the condition to be reviewing financial documents, but I had a medical bill. And when I went to log into my account to see what I could cover, the number I saw didn't match the number I remembered. I sat with my laptop at the kitchen table for a long time. I told myself I'd miscalculated. I told myself maybe the hospital had already begun billing. I told myself there was an explanation that had nothing to do with anyone I knew. Then I called Quincy. Quincy came over that same night with takeout and a yellow legal pad. She's not an attorney, but she has the brain of one. Precise, patient, willing to follow a thread through 40 pages of statements without losing her place. She spread everything out on my table and she didn't say much for a long time, and then she said very quietly, "Nora, when did you give your brother access to your accounts?" I said I hadn't. She turned the statement around so I could see it. The withdrawals had started on the 3rd day of my hospitalization. They were structured carefully, not in round numbers that might trigger alerts, but just under, varied amounts, spread across a few days. It was methodical. It was practiced, almost. Or maybe researched. I don't know which is worse. What I did next wasn't dramatic. I didn't call him immediately and scream. I didn't post anything online. I went to bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I felt the specific weight of being betrayed by someone you had already given so little to that you thought there was nothing left for them to take. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Ms. Vautrine. She was recommended by Quincy, and she had the manner of someone who had heard every variation of the story I was telling and never once been surprised. She asked clear questions. She took notes. When I finished, she said, "He made a significant error." I asked her what error. She said, "He forgot about the wire receipt." When my brother transferred the bulk of the money, there had been a routing number attached to an account in his name. He'd likely assumed I would never pursue it, or that if I did, enough time would have passed that it would be difficult to trace. What he hadn't anticipated was that digital transfers leave clean trails, and that I would get an attorney within a month of leaving the hospital, and that my attorney would know exactly what to request. Ms. Vautrine filed a formal complaint with the bank within the week. She filed a police report. She drafted a civil demand letter that was delivered to my brother's home address. He called me before the letter even arrived. I've thought about that call a lot. I've thought about what he said, and what he didn't say, and the long silences between his sentences. He didn't say he was sorry. Not at the beginning. He said he'd meant to pay it back. He said he was in a hard place and he hadn't been thinking clearly. He said things had been difficult, vague, sprawling things, the kind of things that are meant to make you feel guilty for pursuing accountability. He said, "I thought you might not even remember. I thought it might be a clean start for you." A clean start. I let him talk for a long time, and when he was done, I said, "I have an attorney." He went quiet. I said, "Everything has been documented. The transfers, the account access, the timeline. Mrs. Vautrin has already been in contact with the bank." He said my name, just my name, like a question. I said, "Don't call this number again unless it's through her." I hung up. I'd like to tell you that felt powerful. It did, a little. But mostly, it just felt like closing a door that had always been slightly open. that I'd spent my whole life pretending to believe was warmer on the other side than it actually was. The investigation took 4 months. 4 months of phone calls and documentation. And one very difficult meeting with my parents, in which my mother cried and my father sat very still and looked at the floor. And neither of them said my brother's name in a way that suggested they were angry at him. They were sad, I think, in the particular way that parents are sad when they realize a child has done something indefensible and they have to choose whether to defend it anyway. They didn't defend him, to their credit. But they didn't condemn him either. They sat in the middle of something they couldn't fix and looked like they wished they were somewhere else. I understood it. I didn't excuse it. But I understood it. What happened to my brother? He repaid the full amount, $42,000, plus bank fees, plus the legal costs I'd incurred, as part of a civil settlement reached in February. He was not criminally charged. Ms. Vautrin had advised me that criminal charges were possible, but that a civil settlement was faster and more certain, and I was still recovering and didn't want to spend 3 years in a courtroom. He agreed to the settlement in one meeting. His attorney presented him as remorseful. I wasn't there to hear it. What happened to me, I healed, slower than I wanted to. My ribs took 3 months to stop aching. My brain felt foggy until spring, a kind of low-level static that made me slower to read and quicker to tire. I went back to work part-time in March, full-time in May. I repainted my kitchen that summer, a soft yellow, which sounds insignificant and felt enormous. I called Quincy every Sunday. I didn't call my brother at all. My mother asked me, around Easter, if I thought I'd ever forgive him. I told her forgiveness wasn't really the question I was sitting with. She asked what the question was. I said, what kind of person watches his sister in a coma and thinks about money? She didn't have an answer to that. Neither do I, fully. I've turned it over many times in the years since, and I still can't find the bottom of it. He wasn't desperate, not truly. He had a job, a home, no catastrophic debt. He was opportunistic. He saw a window and he stepped through it. He saw me lying in a hospital bed and he thought about what I had that he didn't. And he acted. There's a version of the story where I explain this as something broken in him from childhood. Something our parents didn't see or didn't address. There's probably truth in that version. But I've stopped feeling responsible for making the pieces fit in a way that lets everyone off the hook. The last time I saw him was at my cousin's wedding, 14 months after everything. We were in the same reception hall for 3 hours. We didn't speak. He looked at me once, from across the room, and I looked back, and then we both looked away. My cousin didn't know what had happened between us, or if she did, she'd had the grace not to bring it up at her wedding. I danced with her at 9:30, and drank 1 glass of champagne, and drove home with the radio off. That night I sat on my porch for a while. It was warm for October. My neighborhood was quiet except for a dog somewhere down the block, barking at something it couldn't reach. I thought about the voice message. The one he'd sent me in the ICU while I was still hooked up to monitors. Just get better. We love you. I thought about how completely I had believed it. How grateful I'd felt. I don't believe things that completely anymore. That's not cynicism, or at least I try not to call it that. It's more like I got quiet inside in a way I hadn't been before. More careful about which doors I leave open, and who I assume is standing warmly on the other side. There are people who will hear this story and focus on what he did, and I understand that. What he did was real, and it caused real harm, and I don't want to minimize it. But what I carry most isn't the anger. It's the quieter thing underneath. The memory of being unconscious in a hospital while someone who said he loved me was making a choice. He made a choice. He made it deliberately and carefully and over the course of several days. And the world kept going and I kept breathing, and none of that stopped him. I am the one who stopped him. And it took me a long time to understand that was enough.